Hello, everyone. My name is Norris West, and I'm Director of Strategic Communications at the Annie Casey Foundation and a member of the Media Impact Funders Board. On behalf of my colleagues on the Media Impact Funders Board, we are excited to welcome you to our third session in our 2021 Media Impact Forum. So thanks for joining us. I'm really glad to be in community with all of you today, a day after the verdict in Minneapolis. A verdict that shows that we might be moving just a tad bit closer to a vision of justice in America. We're a long way from there, but that is indeed a hopeful sign. But for today, we are in the midst of the forum. And since the launch of our forum back in February and continuing through June, we'll continue to hear from experts, leaders, and your colleagues on evidence-based communications in science, health, and the environment. We are talking about the latest research behind it and how your peers are supporting work that strengthens it. If you missed any of the previous discussions, we encourage you to visit the recaps on the Media Impact Funders website. There will be a link in the chat momentarily that will direct you there. Now, even with the increasing interest in science communication and public engagement with science, marginalized individuals and communities are still largely overlooked and undervalued in these efforts. We need to engage diverse audiences in topics related to science and health, and we can't do that without bringing diverse voices to the field. This discussion will explore what intervention funders can make to build and sustain this critical field of practice. So with that context in mind, join us as we hear from Dr. Sunshine Menezes of the University of Rhode Island on the state of inclusive science communications. She will go over the findings of a landscape study supported in part by the Kavli Foundation and the Burroughs Wellcome Fund that she conducted with our colleague, Dr. Katherine Canfield last year. We'll also hear from Dr. Jadida Issler, Assistant Professor of Astrophysics at Dartmouth College, who is an outspoken advocate of inclusion and empowerment in the STEM fields. And finally, we'll hear from Ralph Bouquet, Director of Education and Outreach at NOVA, and scientist activist Evelyn Valdez-Ward, who founded Reclaiming STEM, a workshop that provides training for diverse scientists to learn how to communicate their science at the intersection of research and social justice. Ralph and Evelyn will discuss initiatives that are trying to move the needle on inclusive science communications. So now, I'm gladly going to hand it over to Kishore Hari, who manages strategic partnerships for science engagement at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and he's going to moderate this discussion. So go ahead, Kishore, take it away.
Thank you, Norris, for that introduction. Hi, my name's Kishore Hari, and I work on the Science and Society program at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. I just want to extend my deepest thanks to the entire Media Impact Forum team for bringing us together. As many in philanthropy know, it takes an enormous amount of work to herd us together, and it is deeply appreciated. For today's conversation, we're going to hear from 4 different visionaries in science communication on how they're advancing practice and where we might be able to go. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll have time for questions after each presentation. So I encourage you to use the chat to input your questions as we're going along. After that, we'll move to group Q&A and a discussion, which I hope will be an opportunity to engage in a discussion of what's possible with a more inclusive science communication ecosystem. Before getting into philanthropy, I was a longtime science communicator. This area of work is absolutely near and dear to my heart. And this year, like no other year in my lifetime, demonstrated the absolute necessity of science communication. We saw so many examples of science communication used to its potential, from how and who our public health leaders engage. You know, every time I turn on the TV or open up YouTube, I would see Dr. Fauci or Dr. Kizzy Corbett engaging with a different segment of the US population, or the grassroots efforts that we saw to meet audiences where they are, from door-knocking campaigns at food banks and way too many Zoom town halls. but it also demonstrated the limitations of the science communication ecosystem, our ability to operate at scale with nimbleness and with a level of diversity and credibility to work alongside the communities most impacted by the disease. In what feels like a lifetime ago, I stumbled into science communication because somebody put up a flyer at a conference inviting people to learn about science cafes. That flyer led me to meet a host of people passionate about science communication, who nurtured, encouraged, and supported me on a decades-long journey. I'm really grateful to all those people who helped me, but I was lucky. What really excites me about today's panel, these are four people committed to taking luck out of the equation. Reading their bios alone would take the entire 90 minutes. So I'm going to offer up my own sort of experience of their work. First up is Sunshine. And there are endless words to describe what Sunshine has meant to the ecosystem of science communication. To me, most of all, she has been a community builder, bringing warmth and a gravity to a set of work to advance inclusive science communication. And I'm endlessly grateful for that commitment to keep bringing us together. I'm going to hand it over to Sunshine to get us started.
Thank you so much, Kishore. Those words mean a great deal to me. I'm just going to share my screen here and we'll get started. All right, and I'm also setting my timer so I can stay on time. So thank you so much to the Media Impact Funders Forum for the invitation today. I'm really thrilled to be able to talk with you about this. To start off, I'd like to note that I will mention some of the work that I've done with my collaborator, Dr. Katherine Canfield, but there are hundreds, at least, of people, some of whom are here today, who have been really, really important in building this movement and building these ideas. So I just want to acknowledge that this is a huge community that is contributing to this. When I say inclusive science communication, what I mean is any effort to engage people in conversation or activities regarding science, technology, engineering, math, or medicine that is grounded in inclusion, equity, and intersectionality. Really quickly, I want to note that I lead the Menecap Institute at the University of Rhode Island. We've been working on fostering informed public conversations about science and the environment for more than 20 years. We have been training journalists to cover science, training scientists to become better communicators, and most recently we launched the Inclusive Cycom Symposium. But let's ground this a little bit more, this conversation. So the inclusive science communication movement, and that is definitely what it is grounded in the demand for a paradigm shift, or really a series of shifts that change how marginalized voices are represented, amplified, and valued in both STEM research and in communication, how expertise is understood, what it means to conduct quote unquote community engagement, that is like actually, truly, equitably engaging communities, how our research and our practices as science communication professionals exacerbate or redress inequities. And it also is shifting power in some pretty substantive ways. So historically, apropos of the image that I'm showing on the screen, science communication or outreach, a word that I take great issue with, has been viewed through a very top-down lens, right? Where there are some almighty group of experts, typically people with advanced degrees, who get to say which aspects of science are more or less important, how those conversations should happen, and who gets to be part of the conversation. So those approaches have assumed the interests of our audiences and communities. They have at least minimized and often actively excluded different ways of knowing and different lived experiences. And they have made science feel apart from people's lives rather than essential to it. So we really need to be moving toward a collaborative model that is a place where all parties share their expertise to enrich our understanding of problems and solutions. And of course, all of this happens in a social context. Per Norris's comments, the Chauvin verdict is really important, but not nearly what is needed to achieve justice. And more people are just unwilling to accept the unjust status quo because it is deeply rooted in white supremacy and injustice. So what does this have to do with science? Well, there are ample data to show that science is not the so-called objective undertaking that we might imagine, but is in fact deeply entwined with social issues. And because each of us views the world, views facts through our own various and very specific lenses of experience, values, bias, culture, etc., it's really important that we develop science communication strategies that engage those diverse perspectives rather than minimize them. So with that all said, the Minecap Institute launched the Inclusive Cycom Symposium in 2018. And our original idea was just to highlight the fact that there are people who are doing this work, who really are centering inclusion and equity and intersectionality in their work. And it turns out that we hit a nerve. There was a demand there that we didn't even really know existed. So we did the symposium again in 2019, doubled its length, did a call for proposals, et cetera. And thereafter, we've moved on to a biennial model. So we'll be doing this again in October of this year, virtually this time around, which offers opportunities and challenges. And we're actively looking for more partners. So if you'd like to discuss that, please let me know. So this symposium and this community building has had some really significant impacts that I wanted to share. We're fostering shared identities among people as inclusive science communicators. This is really about building community and sharing learning and resources. And it's also spreading, to other places. So there was, for example, a special research topic in Frontiers in Communication about inclusive science communication that was inspired by the 2018 symposium. I think 16 papers in that collection and more than 70,000 views as of yesterday. We're seeing talks in conferences all over the world. Here I show Kyle Marianne Viterbo, who spoke at the Cycom conference which was held in Europe earlier this year. Various conferences are hosting these conversations. The Inclusive Cycom hashtag on Twitter is getting more and more traction. And just the other day, I was notified about the Coastal Nestorine Research Federation is doing a call for abstracts for a session they've called Not Just Checking a Box, Inclusive Communication as a Way to Transform/Break Scientific Frameworks. And of course, there's all the work that my co-panelists are doing, right? This work is happening in so many really exciting ways. So that leads to this landscape report that I did with Katherine Canfield. Again, thank you to the Kavli Foundation and Burroughs Wellcome Fund for supporting this. So Katie did, 30 interviews with early leaders and innovators in inclusive science communication. Needless to say, this is very much a snapshot. There are far more than 30 people who are doing this, but this is the model for this kind of landscape report. And we selected those people very specifically to have as diverse a group as possible in every way. I will note that we did not get the gender diversity that we had hoped for. And there's a lot going on there, by the way. There are a lot more women engaged in this work. So that's just an aside. And we also did a bunch of focus groups at various conferences. So I'm going to very quickly summarize some of our findings from that. And one of the big ones is, no surprise, there are a ton of silos happening in inclusive science communication. And partly that's because we have this very expansive definition of what constitutes inclusive science communication. So we're looking across a huge range of disciplines, sectors, and what we called in the report modes, which basically means methods and settings. And so you can imagine this as kind of a funnel, right? So from starting with these various disciplines that inform a person's science communication through various sectors, academia, public or private, philanthropy, nonprofits, et cetera. And then finally into mode, there are all of these ways that you could be further funneling a person's focus. And that's fine, except that it means so many people who might be operating in this mode don't know anything about what's happening in this mode. And if we don't know what we don't know, it's very hard to build exchange where we're actually learning from each other instead of, as so often happens in science communication, remaking the wheel. Another really important finding from this report was just recognizing that there were these 3 key traits that many of these early leaders shared. And these are traits, by the way, that have been discussed in a variety of relevant literature, from service learning to equity-focused education to informal science learning. But the thing is, they're being talked about in all of these separate silos and not really coming together. So we identified these 3 points, all of which really circle around the goal of creating equitable interactions. So intentionality is really about how we're thinking about our audience, making sure that we're truly representing and supporting marginalized identities in our science communication. Reciprocity is about co-creating benefit for the science communicator and the audience, specifically to address present and past inequities. And reflexivity is this continuous reflection about how we're doing this work and how we can improve it. I could say a lot more about that, but for time I will not. So a couple other challenges I want to note. We found, as I noted, there's the silos, but those silos also bring with them real challenges in terms of even the language that we use to describe the work that we're doing. We have lots of different language that basically means the same thing. And all of that siloed language can limit our ability to interact. We also have this concern that so many people who are doing what I would call inclusive science communication don't necessarily recognize that term or relate to it. So there are all these people who could be part of this movement who don't see themselves as part of it. We also have limited diversity among the early leaders, and this comes back to the gender point that I made before, but it's not just about gender. This is also about race and ethnicity, and there is a significant lack of formal curricula and training to build the skills and competencies. People want a quick to-do list of how to be an inclusive science communicator, and it doesn't work that way. So we need a lot more, formal and informal curricula for that. So moving forward, wrapping up now, we have a long list of recommendations in the report, but I'm going to focus on just a couple. We need some new framing that really invites people from all of these disparate approaches to come together and really share and learn from one another. We need in-person and virtual opportunities for networking and resource sharing that can really foster collaboration and unite the movement. And there are many examples of this already, by the way. I mean, I mentioned this symposium. There's also the Cycom Trainers Network. There's a new Live Sci Collective for STEM public engagement professionals. There's the Listen Network. There's many, many different things out there, but it's important for us to keep our eye on the prize and make sure we are building those collaborations. And we also really need to support the innovative early career communicators whose approaches are entirely novel and exciting and brilliant, because they need the opportunity to truly lead as they are, which means giving them power. And I'm not going to talk about funders right now. I have a lot to say about that, but we're going to come back to it later. I'll close there.
Thanks, Sunshine. And you've definitely piqued my interest when you say that you have some recommendations for funders. So I definitely think we're going to come back to that. One thing that I wanted to ask, and before I ask my question, I just want to encourage, if anyone listening has a question, please drop it in a chat. And we have time for a quick question or two. My first question is, like, I had the honor of going to Inclusive Cycom, the symposium in years past. And one thing that really struck me is that it felt like a nascent community of practice, like in the earliest stages of coming through that. How has the past year, where people have been put under various forms of stress, both institutionally and personally, impacted the progress towards that developing that community of practice?
That is a great question. And I'm thinking of it in a few different ways. So you know, I am seeing, because I'm paying attention to this, I see a lot more people talk in various spheres, a lot more people like using the language of inclusive Cycom, which makes me think that people are, that like sense of belonging is coalescing a little bit, which helps people connect to one another. Like, oh, I see you doing this thing that I'm interested in, and we have a word, a shared language that we can now connect about. I'll tell you that we've seen a lot of requests to join this listserv that we operate for inclusive Cycom. So people are clearly looking for other ways to connect. But most importantly, so we've been working on this, this research project that was started with the 2019 Symposium, where at that symposium, we focused a lot on facilitating difficult conversations across difference. So we wanted to do a follow-up survey with attendees to ask how people are thinking about that activity in the context of this past year. And still working on the results, but the upshot is people are thinking very, very differently about how they practice this, when they practice it, why they practice it, and what they need to do it well. So I guess I can say that there's this growing recognition. Again, this comes back to like skills and competencies, right? People increasingly understand that to do this work effectively, there are skills that we need to build personally and collectively that don't just fall off trees, you know, like we have to go find them. And I think that's a really important recognition for this growing community of practice. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but that's where my brain went. So.
Thank you for that, Sunshine. Allison asked a great question in chat. I'm actually going to hold that question for the group discussion at the end so that all the panelists can reflect on it, because I think it is a big question. But if you do have more questions, please pop them into chat as we go along. I'm going to move us on to our next panelist. Beyond being a leader in astrophysics, and trust me, if I had my way, I would just ask astrophysics questions for about an hour, to our next panelist, Dr. Jadida Issler is one of the leaders of Vanguard STEM, and Vanguard is such a great word for the new ideas and bold development she brings to this field. And what really inspires me about her work is how she constantly expands the boundaries of science communication to not only being about science, but brings that sense of communicating using your whole self and expanding that communication isn't just about science in this context, it's about all of the elements that we bring at once. So please join me in welcoming Jadida. Over to you.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Kishore. Like, you can't do that to me when I'm like about to start talking. I'm all teary and emotional, which I actually am in real life. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks, everybody. I hope you're finding yourselves at least okay during these times. I'm going to follow up on Norris's point and a point that Sunshine made, many points that Sunshine made, but a particular point about acknowledging this moment. So I wanted to take a moment and acknowledge those of us who went to bed yesterday contending with the very complex emotions surrounding the guilty verdicts for George Floyd's murderer. I also want to acknowledge those who woke up to the devastating news of Ma'Khia Bryant's death at the hands of the police. And to bring it into a science context, the arrest of Kiara Wilmot in 2013 for doing a science experiment at school and being arrested for that science experiment. These are the things that affect us as both those that are in and beyond the literal and figurative ivory towers, and that are, in many ways are no different than those who are actively being accosted or killed every day. I want to add to that complex web of emotion the fact that it's actually Black and Enviro Week on Twitter. If you haven't seen that, there's this emerging communication mechanism of every week a group of Black scientists get together and celebrate themselves with roll calls and all kinds of things. Vanguard STEM and Black in STEM have been doing those things for years, but there's a reemergence of that. So there's a complicated web of emotions there, and certainly just trying to contend with the unrelenting injustice, racism, and white supremacist structures that we know exist. And I toyed with whether or not I was going to say all that, And if you've seen me speak at all, you knew I was going to say it. And I'm going to say it because this complicated story is actually the complicated story of inclusive science communication. To Sunshine's point, there's just no way to talk about science and in our hope to use it to engage and better the world if we're not talking about the context in which it is experienced. So this multi-layered milieu is the place where I find my grounding and my work towards making sure to communicate science effectively. So said another way, I don't think that there's a way for science communication to be relevant or sufficient if it doesn't have an intersectional and inclusive lens. I think it takes people and organizations like the ones that are here to address the complex socio-technological issues of our time. So if your science communication or your portfolio of science communicators doesn't have those lenses or frameworks, then it's outdated at best and damaging at worst. So that's where I'll start my conversation. And then you want to know who I am, which is totally odd given how disturbing I really am as a person. But that being said, my name is Jadida Issler. I am a Black woman, astrophysicist, former Black girl who really loves space. That's actually who I am in a nutshell. I think space is cool. I've loved it since I was very young. And I remember that my family loved that I love space as much as I did because it was the one time that I stood still. So every night I had the privilege of living in a place where you could see the night sky. And so every night I'd be like, Mom, can I go outside and look at the sky? And she'd be like, are you gonna just go and lay in the backyard and look up? And I was like, yes. She was like, have at it, live your best life. And I really appreciated that. And I didn't know at the time, but that was the kind of motivation and excitement I needed to really keep forward with this thing. Because at the time I didn't know about astrophysics. I just knew the night sky was beautiful and I wanted to know more about it. Fast forward to, so the way that story goes is I basically found the night sky. I thought that was amazing. And then I looked and found this book and I found the word astrophysicist. And that is legit the coolest word I've ever heard. Well, at least at 12, it was. And so I was like, okay, I'm totally going to do this work. And I remember as a kid, when people had asked me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'd say, oh, I want to be an astrophysicist. And at the time, I didn't know that they were saying, like, I heard back, oh, you do, right? And it's over time, I realized that I was really hearing, oh, you do, right? And those sort of nuances of my science identity with like who I am as a person. So that identity, interest, tension that sometimes exists in the world. I went on to, I found out about black holes, which was like literally the end of like any pursuit of what exactly I was going to do. Because I was like, you mean to tell me I can study these things that are actually the coolest thing in the universe, like legit whole universe? On it. I'm on it. And that became the goal for my life. I went to Norfolk State, which is a historically Black college, Black university, and they fostered my love affair for science in general, for physics in particular, and towards astrophysics. So once I found out about black holes and their role in changing my life, but then their ability to be a gateway to wonderment, it became literally the central focus of my story. So what kind of black holes do I study? This is for you, Kishore. I study black holes that are supermassive, 1 million to 1 billion times the mass of the sun. And these particular kinds of black holes spin up jets of particles that are moving basically like the speed of light. So they're like nature's particle accelerators. And I know they are the coolest thing. You don't have to affirm that for me. I know we are agreed in that sentiment. And using those black holes and the study of them to, like I said, create this gateway of wonderment, this personal, social, economical, and intellectual gateway that folks could come in, be curious about a thing and have it open up the opportunity to actually learn something new. That has been sort of a tool, staple tool in my life. So I asked Sabira to deploy a poll for me, and I'm going to ask her to do that right now on screen. And the question is, what would happen to the Earth's orbit if the sun turned into a black hole? And it's a poll. No one will see your answer. I'll give you 30 seconds to choose. So the choices for those so just let me read them out loud. 1, we would immediately be pulled into the new sun black hole. 2, nothing, we would carry on along our merry way. 3, we would be pushed out of our orbit and towards the edge of the solar system. 4, don't quiz me on black hole astrophysics during a media impact funders call. Just choose however you like and we'll discuss. So let me give you 30 seconds. Not really 30 seconds, but I'm the only one counting, so it doesn't matter. Could I see the results of that? Yes, you are. Yes, you are. The answer is B. Nothing would happen. We carry on along our merry way. The reason for that is black holes are actually really normal, except they're super exotic, but they're just normal matter compressed into a very small space. So if you took out the sun and put exactly the same mass black hole, the Earth would just continue on its orbit because all it feels is the gravity from that thing over there. Right? And so nothing would happen, you'd be fine. 8 minutes later, you'd run into the problem that there's no sun. And so you run into other problems, but I particularly wrote my question as orbit, so you wouldn't think of those things. So, right, there, and I know now that you have lingering questions about astrophysics and black holes, and I am here for it all day long. So thinking about those things, thinking about how astrophysics has the ability to draw people in, to capitalize on curiosity, and then allow minds to be changed is why I do this work. And I feel like the combination of things that I've presented to you so far in this conversation represent key aspects of my work as a public intellectual. I really want to be, I insist on being fully myself, but I am also fully an astrophysicist. It's important to me. I also work on STEM equity policy, both in my profession and at the national level. I have a nonprofit and an organization called Vanguard STEM that does this kind of STEM as social justice. And I want to just thank the Moore Foundation for their funding, as well as NSF and National Geographic. And most importantly is I have this ongoing project of being a free Black STEM woman, right? The person who has the space and opportunity, or creates the space and opportunity, to live my best life as a multi-talented human without apology, because I think that's important to adding to the narrative of what success looks like. So my experience and resonance as a science communicator comes, I think, and is both informed by my identities and my interests. Them together, that intersectional STEM identity is what we call it in our field, adding to the language, sunshine. That's what we call it over in my neck of the woods. And we're thinking on, we've written a peer-reviewed article about these notions for Vanguard STEM, which you'll get later on. But I wanted to think about science identity because it is the way that you view yourself and the way the world views you as just a part of what science communication is. Your identity is its own communicator. Your science identity is its own communication. And that interplay informs the conversation between people as it relates to STEM. And so the work that I do is to try to communicate not specific knowledge about Black holes and about the universe in general, and also specific knowledge about who has the skill to do that work and what modes we can use to do that self-same work. It's informed by, and I've constantly been encouraged by, the work of Kim Tallbear, who forwarded this notion of standing with. And the way she said it, this is her quote, is, "I am figuring out how to seek out and articulate overlapping respective intellectual, ethical, and institution building projects, how to share goals and desires while staying engaged in critical conversation and producing new knowledge and insight." And I feel like that's what I want to do. There's no difference between me as an astrophysicist and me as a Black woman, period. That can be super motivating and encouraging if people see me and they recognize themselves in me and they say, I want to keep going for this. But it's also very complicated. There's no difference between me and Kiera Wilmot, and there's no difference between me and Makia Bryant. There's just no difference. And so thinking about the complicated ways that we show up and be science communicators and perform science identity is really important. I have another story that I want to share about myself, and I think it's one of the best examples of why I do the work that I do before I step to the side. So very early on in my career, I spent a lot of time in classrooms, like visiting classrooms. As a postdoc and early career faculty, I would go and talk to like 6th grade classes about black holes. And the examples that I gave back then were about how many teachers you could stuff into a taxi cab before you could create a black hole. They took great pleasure in that question. And I remember I was talking about black holes, and I was telling them all the stories about, like how you make them and what's so cool about them, and asking them polls just like I asked you. And at the end I said, okay, well, that's the story. Do you have any questions? I'm happy to answer them. And I answered the question, and hands shot up across the room. And one little girl raised her hand, little black girl, she raised her hand. And I said, yes, what's your question? How can I help you? She's like, what kind of hair products do you use on your hair? At that time, I had a big shock of curls, and I used to wear them in a twist out. And I remember the class sort of chuckled a little bit. And she asked a question, and I could not help but smile, right? Because what could be interpreted as her trying to derail the conversation was actually her seeing herself in me. She was seeing that she could be me, and maybe if she used the same hair products I use, she could get more like I am. That was a really important moment for me. So I said, okay, all right, bet. Here's the deal. If you ask me a science question, I will give you a list of the hair products that I use. And she said, okay. And so I said, I'm gonna give you time. And I went on and I answered all the other students' questions. And I came back to her at the end. I was like, listen, we made a deal. What's your question? She proceeded to ask me the most insightful question about black holes that I had been asked by a 6th grader ever. Like, she just nailed it. And I was taken aback. She asked the question, I answered the question. We had this whole science conversation, and I forgot about the hair products. And so I was much like, miss, you owe me. And so I gave her the hair products, and that's obviously for me the consummate example of what the kind of intersectional STEM identity can be. But I don't want to confuse that kind of story and my particular style of being with a success story. Stories like mine, individual stories of individual success, don't move the needle on the inequities that exist in science communication, and in society. And so we have to think about all of the specific ways we reassign what's happening when stories like mine are put forward as the example of how or what to be. The numbers, both in science and in science communication, aren't uniquely impacted because there's lack of interest. We know that's not true. The data don't support a significant lack of difference with identity in science, interest in science. There's not a lack of talent. When you solve for individual levels of talent and exposure to information, folks perform at approximately the same level. And it's not a lack of understanding. At this point, there are so many ways to know about science. Most people know it exists, certainly in a COVID world. But it is about connecting all those pieces together to build a coherent story. So I think it's important to have individual interventions and successes, but what we really need is structural change for systems. And I think folks on this call know that know themselves how to do that work. There are others around that can do it. As Kishore mentioned, my team and I's intervention is Vanguard STEM, which I'm happy to talk about at some other point when we're not on time. But ultimately, if I had a wish list, in addition to laying out my entire framework, which I will not do, I would want to see a reallocation of resource, power, and accountability that would have substantive impact on these conversations. I would hope that science funders and philanthropists would investigate more deeply and commit to new definitions of what success is. I think it's important to note that inclusion can't simply be trying to get new people to look an old way, that we really do have to emphasize what has in the past been inequitable to come up with something new and different. So Ultimately, I've said this before, and I think I'll say it again. Ultimately, what I'm hoping to see is structural approaches to creating generosity around opportunity so that more people can continue to show and communicate their interest in science and not be summarily removed from the conversation. So with that, I will hand the floor back to my colleagues.
Thank you so much for that. I'm wondering if, I don't think we got to see the poll results. Maybe we could take a quick peek. I'm very curious. And if they're not coming up for everyone, it's 53% thought we'd immediately be pulled into the black hole. 13% said nothing would happen. We'd carry along on our merry way. 30% said we'd be pushed out of our orbit, and only 3% said don't quiz me about astrophysics during a media impact funders call, which I think is the most important result. Any quick reaction? Is that, just out of curiosity, Jadida, is that typical? Like that kind of span of reactions?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I have one question, and if others have follow-up questions, please post them in the chat. I was struck by your use of the word generosity, because the one thing in your story that struck me is when your mother said, go be your best self, go in the backyard and look up at how generous and loving that was. And when I think about some of the structural problems in science communication, like the word mentorship comes up a lot for me, especially mentorship across identities. And I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the structural changes you see as necessary to be able to mentor across many different identities when it comes to our approaches to science communication.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's loaded. So let me see if I can answer them all, and please hold me to it if I don't. So let me just say, to the generosity of opportunity, yeah, that's something that I've been working on recently to articulate. And what I'm talking about is effectively that like extra dose of thing you don't have to do. You know, I think right now, and I should say right now, I say right now, but the literature suggests that when folks are unfamiliar, in unfamiliar context, they will hew very closely to the rules. But when they know and understand a context and they're like, oh, well, that'll be fine. Well, that's generosity. And what I'm asking for, calling for is that sense of that word when we're thinking about what the field can be. Mentorship. Mentoring to me is very tricky, even mentoring across difference, right? It's incredibly important. It's part of the work, you know, my team and I do all the time, but it can deeply embed inequity and propagate notions of difference in ways that can themselves be troubling. So when I think of structural changes that can happen, one example for me is, you know, there's no intrinsic reason why a person who has a good idea must also be able to write a 15-page proposal and have that proposal written in standard English. Or even written at all, right? And so if that's the only mechanism by way that one can convey competence, then that's a structural barrier. I think, you know, one example, just personal example, is I think when I talk. That's my best mode of processing information. And so my best conversations happen actually in conversation and not in writing. So I can write a proposal because I'm multiply talented, but if you're asking me what would be best for me, it would actually be a conversation. But as I understand right now, there's no formal way for me to have a conversation with a person and be like, yes, all right, let's go. So to me, that's one example of a structural change that could be impactful. It's minor, but still, I think, a good example.
Thank you. And one thing I'm going to put a pin in and come back to that you brought up is defining success. And I think that's going to be an area that we talk about across all the panelists in the discussion section. We're going to move on to bring on Ralph. I say this with all the admiration I can muster in my heart. Ralph exudes peak teacher energy to me. He is that teacher that I loved from back in the day, partly because I think he's a former teacher. But I really mean that teacher that created the environment where people want to learn and want to explore. For me, that was my chemistry teacher, Mr. Weiland, had a huge impact on my life and career. And so I love that Ralph brings that to everything he does. And I just want to straight up say right now, I'm so envious of Ralph because I grew up watching Nova every week with my family, and I have this incredible fanboy energy for the work that he leads there. So please join me in welcoming Ralph Bouquet as he talks about some of the work that he's been leading.
All right. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kishore, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to the Media Impact Funders for the opportunity to present today and to share this space with so many illustrious and accomplished scientists and science communicators. I'm really just honored to be here with you all, and also just grateful for the community of funders who have made so much of the work possible. Folks like Corporation of Public Broadcasting, the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support of the Nova Science Studio program, which I'll be talking about today. And yeah, just really appreciate the time to really share this work with you all. And again, like Kishore mentioned, my name is Ralph Bouquet. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach for NOVA. I'm a former high school biology and chemistry teacher. I taught in Philadelphia for several years, and I've been just really sort of blessed to have the opportunity to bring some of the talents and the skills and sort of the training that I got as an educator in the classroom to thinking about the impact of the work that we do at NOVA, and really how we can ensure that the work that we're doing is not only sort of, you know, focus on curating and creating sort of this incredible multimedia work, but also really focus on empowering educators, youth, lifelong learners to really foster curiosity in the sciences, to promote inclusive science communication, and to, I think, ultimately think about what role we can play in amplifying the voices of the next generation of leaders in STEM, and what that generation will look like. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about one of our programs, the Nova Science Studio program, which is really focused on thinking about how we can create pathways for youth in science communication. So I'm just going to transition over to doing a little screen share action and get into my teacher bag, and then we will be off. All right. Okay, hope everybody can see that. Somebody please yell on the panel if you cannot. But again, our focus really for this presentation is really thinking about what are the pathways we can create and what does the future of science storytelling really look like. And so I just wanted to also give shout outs to my incredible team at Nova Education. So this is a department within Nova that's really focused on producing resources. So we do everything from host virtual field trips, produce resources. We have a collection of over 1,600 resources on PBS Learning Media that are taken from Nova broadcast and digital content, as well as a wide range of science communication events. And really our goal is to really think about how we can create these spaces for these conversations to happen around our science content, but more broadly around these issues. And so I want to really focus on this one core question today. And that is sort of, what's the future of science storytelling? What does it look like? And I'm going to talk about sort of a couple of examples of things and areas where I feel like it's important for us to understand sort of the changes that are happening in the media ecosystem that are informing sort of what science communication looks like, but also sort of the responsibility that we have in this space and the opportunities we have in this space, as well as some of the threats that we have to deal with and contend with in this space as well. And I know these are things that Dr. Issler has mentioned earlier, then other folks mentioned a little bit earlier, talking about sort of, you know, really understanding and reconciling with the history of science communication, what it's looked like in the past, and the harm that's been caused by sort of allowing sort of one sole narrative and authoritative voice to really sort of dominate the conversation about what science looks like, who's it for, and what its impact should be in our world and our community. So the first thing I think it's important to consider in this conversation is how the future of science storytelling, I think, has to really be focused on thinking about the stories at the intersection of science and social justice issues. And I think this is very, very important because it's important for us to think about how we can ensure that our audiences understand the science that is underpinning all the wide range of issues that impact them. And whether those issues are thinking about, you know, how do we destigmatize the language of addiction and help people to understand sort of addiction as a disease and not a moral failing? How do we address sort of the rampant racism and sexism that we see sort of in the STEM career space as well? We just released recently The Picture of Scientists, which is available to stream on the NOVA website, which really sort of examines the experiences of women scientists throughout their careers and sort of, you know, the amount of sexism that they deal with in doing their work. So really thinking about what can we do to ensure that we are helping to change knowledge change attitudes, change behavior, and help people really understand the way in which these intersections impact them, and how to also acknowledge the harm in the history that has happened through the production of knowledge in science, and really broadly speaking. And so I just wanted to do a quick shout out to an event that we did about medical racism, and an upcoming film that we're working on about medical racism, and really wrestling with this history and how we can make sure that our audiences understand it, and how it informs sort of the ways in which they currently engage with not only our scientific institutions, but also our medical institutions as well. The second thing that I think it's important for us to consider is the role that we have to play in thinking about producing content that can proactively address misinformation as well as disinformation, and also build digital media literacy skills. And I think, this past year has been such a clear example of sort of the harm of misinformation and disinformation plays, and sort of people's ability to understand sort of the public health implications of dealing with a pandemic. So this is a study from the Pew Research Center that found that nearly a quarter of US adults believe that the coronavirus was intentionally planned. And I think I want to also point out something from the Stanford History Re-Education Group. This is an earlier study from 2019. I think there's this common assumption that because our young people, our Gen Z folks are sort of digital natives, that they're somehow inoculated against the impact of misinformation because they've been on these platforms their entire lives. And that is just, so much of the research shows that is simply not the case, that even with sort of their understanding, the familiarity with these platforms, with these tools, that there still is a considerable amount of work that needs to be done to ensure that students understand sort of how to spot misinformation, sort of how, which sort of sources to trust. And I think it's imperative that we think about work that can really help people to build these skills, and to really recognize this immense threat that science communication is facing with, especially when you consider the platforms and the role that platforms play when they prioritize engagement over facts and over truth. You end up in situations where things that are not true are being propagated and shared at rates that are frankly just unimaginable. 20 years ago, we have now a printing press in everybody's pocket that can now be sort of honed and tuned to the very things that are going to sort of stimulate their engagement. So what does that mean for science misinformation, or for science communication, to sort of navigate in a world where this is the case? And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is sort of the future of science storytelling. I think has to acknowledge and really reckon with the access of video production and distribution. And sort of, I think there's an immense sort of democratization almost of the tools of production, but also these platforms of distribution. And so I wanted to make a note about this study that came out in 2019. And I think it sort of caused this big moral panic. But it was a study done by the Harris Poll and Logo that found that when they sampled 8 to 12-year-olds in the US and the UK and China, particularly in the US and the UK, they found that about 30% of students said that what they wanted to be when they grow up was as a vlogger or a YouTuber. And of course, there were so many articles that spurned that sort of spiraled out of this. People saying, "Oh my gosh, this is so bad for our society." And I think it's important to consider sort of what this says and what this reflects about sort of a society in which so much of the personality, so much of the voices, so much of sort of the authoritative figures for many young people today are, folks on YouTube, are these vloggers who are found just really compelling ways to communicate their stories, to communicate their ideas in ways that are very engaging for a lot of young people, and in ways that also seem a lot more accessible because they are. The tools of production are in their pockets. And so I think we have to conceptualize that while this may seem like a threat for so many people to really sort of, rationalize, oh my gosh, students are not thinking about these careers in the ways they used to. Why do they not want to be astronauts, when in fact we know that the overwhelming majority of people are not astronauts? And while it's important for us to want to aspire to these roles, I think it's important also to think about what are the opportunities here when we have, platforms that allow for massive distribution, allow for easy video production. What opportunities for science communicators can we sort of nurture and develop out of this interest in video production and in communication as well? And so I think TikTok, has shown us a wide range of these examples, but I also want us to think about what it means for, and this is sort of a gift from one of our videos, to have all these tools, your camera rigs, your mics, all being able to really be collapsed into just a phone, and what opportunities there are there. So I want to then transition to talking about the Nova Science Studio program. I'm going to quickly play a trailer, which I think does a great job of really summarizing sort of what our goals are with this program, and how we're really sort of thinking about all these sort of different aspects of the future of science storytelling, sort of science and social justice issues, access to video production and distribution platforms, and as well, what was my second one? The issue of misinformation, disinformation, how to build digital media literacy skills. So I'm just going to play this quick section of this trailer.
The Mars rover journey, genetic engineering, citizen scientists uncovering lead poisoning in Flint, Michigan. These are just some of the stories Nova has told in nearly 50 years on American television. But what's the future of science storytelling, and what does it look like? Well, we think it looks a lot like this, and that is why we need you. The Nova Science Studio is a new program that allows you to write, produce, and publish science videos of your own.
Showed me a lot of skills that I think I could use in the future.
The goal is simple. We want to empower you with the skills to be able to tell the science stories in your own backyard through collaboration with Nova staff, educators, and experts.
I think we at Nova are really invested in helping to find and train the next generation of science communicators.
The most important thing that Nova Science Studio teaches is, I think, the process. Knowing what a good story is, selecting the elements that will make it a good story, editing.
What's the idea that we're trying to communicate? And then we need to come up with the right visual to communicate that idea.
How to find scientists to interview, how to put it all together.
All right. Okay, great. All right, can everybody
The
see
Mars
that?
rover journey.
We're not doing that. Okay. So, and again, I wanted to talk about this program very quickly. The Nova Science Studio program is Nova's first youth science communication program. And really what our focus is thinking about, again, those 3 points that I mentioned earlier, how we can build science communication, video production, and digital media literacy skills in teens by really teaching them how to communicate science via short form video. And so part of what we've done in this program is we piloted initially in 2019 as a pilot just in Boston, where we worked with 3 sites, and we essentially worked with these students, provided them with some video production equipment, but we're really focused on designing a curriculum that was focused on how do we teach sort of best practices for science communication, and how do we also do this within the scope, within the framework around the ideas that are compelling to students themselves, and really sort of focus on giving students the agency to tell stories about issues of their communities. More recently, in January 2021, this year, we launched the program as a virtual program, which is now serving a cohort of about 30 students in 5 sites across the country. So each student is working with a site coordinator who is somebody who has training as an educator or a science communicator, and is working to really help students develop their own ideas for stories. And so in the pilot, we had students do reporting on everything from Black maternal mortality rates to whether or not AI is a threat to the working class, to sort of the connections between teen depression and social media. And so really, again, focusing on stories that are really relevant to students. And then what our goal is with this program is to really provide a platform for them to produce and to disseminate this content. So we have a Nova Science Studio YouTube channel, which is currently right now contains our tutorial videos, but over the course of the next couple months, the students will be refining their ideas, will be shooting them, will be editing, will be interviewing their scientists via Zoom, and then packaging all their content together to tell these stories about things that are happening in their communities. And so we're really excited about this because not only have we sort of launched this program, but it's also, I think, really prompted us to think about additional content as well, particularly around the issue of science misinformation. So in addition to the program itself, we've also launched a new series on science misinformation called Misinformation Nation, and also a whole set of video production tutorials that are really focused on video production for folks who are interested in science communication. So thinking about how do we contextualize sort of the same sort of, a lot of the tutorials that you might see online, but to really focus them with intentionality around science communication. And so I'm really excited about this because one of the things that we're hoping to do is to really expand this program and to really make the curriculum publicly available for schools, for journalism programs, science clubs, both anybody in the informal but also formal education space to be able to use this program, to be able to use this curriculum, and to really sort of create an opportunity and pathways for young people to get invested and interested and engaged in science communication. And part of the goal too is to realize, like, while we feel like it's so important for students to want to pursue STEM careers, we also feel it's important that there's sort of a baseline understanding and set of skills that we feel like that they will gain from this program, that whether or not, they ultimately believe that STEM is sort of the pathway for them with regards to their career, that they still are building on this fundamental building blocks for around science literacy, around the ability to sort of spot misinformation. So one of the things that we're looking to do is really tracking the impact throughout the course of the program with surveys, both pre and post surveys, to really track sort of whether or not students are developing skills for effective science communication and video production, whether or not they're being exposed to STEM careers, particularly for a group of students who are consistently underrepresented in STEM, who are often marginalized in STEM. And that's a really sort of intentional focus of this program, to think about how we can recreate these pathways. And so really quickly, I'm just going to show a short clip from one of our misinformation videos which really highlights sort of the approach that we're taking that's really focused on, examples and sort of stories that are really relevant to young people in a style that we feel like can be really appealing to them as well.
I'm Alex Clark. I'm a journalist, instructor of video, and a filmmaker. And with Nova Science Studio, we're going to be breaking down misinformation. Misinformation is shared millions of times a day on Facebook alone, so it's easy to get tangled up. So at first, we're told that masks are not necessary, and then many areas are requiring people to wear them. By the summer of 2020, people in all 50 states are wearing masks as part of their everyday attire. I got my keys, wallet, mask, I'm good to go. But thousands of people remain convinced that masks were not effective. And many of the people who did not believe in masks relied on social media as their primary source of science information. And there is a lot of misinformation out there, some of which was very convincing. There were even fake notices from the CDC advising that people should not wear masks, which is wild. All of this had a very real effect. A model from the Institute of Health Metrics at the University of Washington found that if 95% of Americans had worn masks starting in mid-June, there would have been nearly 22,000 fewer deaths by the 1st of October. So yes, the stakes are high when it comes to spotting misinformation. By the way, science misinformation is defined as a statement that contradicts what established science tells us to be true. We're all prone to believe many of these messages. It's part of our human nature. But don't take it from me. Dominique Brassard is an expert on science misinformation. And she points out that often people share misinformation only because it aligns with their worldview.
All right. And so the video proceeds to sort of really examine all the reasons by which misinformation is shared and why it's believed. But really, again, our focus is in creating an opportunity in the space that allows our viewers to really engage with these concepts and to really think more deeply and to hopefully develop a skill set of their own about how to spot misinformation when they encounter it. And then finally, to close,
telephone.
I want to mention briefly how this is part and fits into this larger vision of Nova as truly a multimedia, multi-platform science communication brand. And so making sure that I think it's just so important for us to make sure that in this expanded media ecosystem, it's crucially important for us to meet our audiences where they currently are, and to also think about and examine where they will be. And so thinking about what it looks like for a science communication brand like Nova that's been around for nearly 50 years now, to not only be known as a broadcast sort of platform or broadcast show, but as sort of a multi-platform brand where folks who are engaged in YouTube, folks who are into podcasts can find something that really addresses their needs and their interests and sparks their curiosity about these issues. And I think this is a really great example of one of the things that we're doing right now. In 2020, viewers under 25 were their fastest growing demographic on the Nova YouTube channel. And so this speaks again to really the need for us to have much more robust investment in the digital space as an opportunity for the brand to really, again, meet our new audiences where they are and to create opportunities and content that really addresses their issues. And I'm just sharing a quick snapshot of a clip from the Picture of Scientist film about sort of the discrimination and harassment that women in STEM face. But if you look at the comments, it's just really incredible just to see sort of the ways in which, you know, the stories were so compelling for so many of our audience members to see their stories reflected in a way that that they haven't before about these particular issues. And so thank you so much again for this opportunity to present, and yeah, happy to take a question or two.
I'm going to ask a quick question before we move on. First of all, positive comments on social media, that's almost a miracle unto itself right there. But I just want to track back and say, like, you really, this program exudes to me, you're handing over the camera to somebody else. You're giving them the power in that transition. How is what they're doing, the innovations they're developing, informing how you tell stories on the larger scale at NOVA? How do you hope to translate the innovations that they bring into the long-term structures that NOVA has created over decades?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kishore. I mean, I think part of it for us, it's a learning experience, I think, for us to do that and to provide that agency. I think one of our goals really is to think about how can we create sort of a lane and sort of an avenue for student-produced content that really sort of values and centers their voice. And I think the importance and the value of that is in, first of all, allowing us to see sort of and acknowledge our own sort of gaps with regards to what are the stories that we are missing. I think even already from the conversation that we've had with the students in the program, they are finding sort of opportunities to talk about, you know, folks in their community who are dealing with issues that I think would have, you know, you might not have ever sort of seen sort of come into an editorial meeting. And I think that value is important because, first of all, this is the audience that we are meant to serve, particularly as a public media organization. We have a mandate, you know, to serve the public and to serve all the public. And I think our ability to do that, you know, if we are not engaging, you know, these voices, if we are not proactive about creating those spaces, means that that we'll be left out and we won't be sort of serving, you know, the community that we can serve to the best of our abilities. So I think it's crucially important, and also I think as a way to even create those new audiences as well, and to invite those new audiences to see themselves in our work. And it's like, what better way to do that than to, you know, hand the camera over and to allow students the opportunity to really tell these stories and to highlight the ways in which they're engaging with science in their own communities and the way in which they're being impacted by the science happening in their communities as well.
Thank you, Ralph. You gave us a lot to chew on that I think we're going to revisit after our final presenter, and which brings us to Evelyn. I can say a lot of things about Evelyn, but to me, Evelyn's an unstoppable force in this space. She's defined by not allowing labels to define her. And I am just humbled constantly in how she's translated work from advocacy to support science communication at so many different intersections, especially the intersection of science and social justice. So please join me in welcoming Evelyn Valdez-Ward.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for having me. It is such a huge honor to be in this space with the other people that have spoken, because although Sunshine mentioned it's a growing field within science communication, it actually feels like a really small world, and it's always really interesting to see how we've all overlapped in one way or another. So I'm really excited to share with you my work on reclaiming STEM. Just as a quick background, I am a fifth-year PhD student at the University of California, Irvine. I started with plants. I thought plants were going to be my world, and then I started doing advocacy because I was formerly undocumented. I only just became a permanent resident at the beginning of last year. But with all the anti-immigrant propaganda that was going on, the DACA ended, and there was a lot of attacks coming down onto the undocumented community. I then became an advocate. And there's a lot that I could say about that. I mean, you could probably find articles more about my story. But becoming an advocate is what led me into this world of science policy and science communication, and really wanting a space where we use science communication and policy to advance social justice, and I just wasn't finding it anywhere. And so today I wanted to cover what we do with reclaiming STEM and why it's important to bring your identity and culture within these STEM spaces. So first I'll start with the basic Cycom model. So you have the scientist who decides, you know what, I want to start communicating my science, or I want to get involved with science policy. And so then they start disseminating this information to the public. Ideally, this would be an engagement that goes back and forth. Then the scientist says, okay, well, maybe I also want some exposure with media. And then they start interacting with media. Ideally, again, this would be a fair back and forth exchange. And then the media then disseminates whatever information to the public. Now, there are a lot of issues with this system in general that can include, for example, the media has its own issues with which scientists are being highlighted, what stories are being told, what science is even worthy of sharing with the public, and then the public's engagement with the media, a lot of issues with misinformation, which sources to actually listen to, and then of course, how the public interacts with the scientists themselves. Now, there are a lot of outside influences that can affect this entire model, which includes social, political, and environmental. But one of the most important things that I think is kind of ignored within this model is the scientists themselves, where the identity of the scientist can affect what the media is portraying about these identities, or which stories are being told. It's no secret that the media presents a picture of a scientist that is not reflective of our nation's demographic, and it's not reflective of everybody within our scientific community. It's also no secret that because of these outside influences, the way that the public might perceive a scientist is solely based on their identity. So from my personal example, because I was an undocumented advocate, I never was the undocumented scientist. People only saw me for being undocumented. So often my scientific identity was stripped from everything that I was doing. And it just often happens with a lot of people in their identities, where they are just seen as the way that they are presenting themselves, but they are never truly just their identity and being a scientist. And additionally, within these communities themselves, there's a lot of exclusion and silencing and a lot of issues within the science community itself, but also within the community of science communication and policy. Now, as was mentioned before, even with this increasing interest in science communication and public engagement with science, marginalized and minoritized individuals and communities are largely overlooked and undervalued in these efforts. And we see this in our work as well, where every time we present the workshop and we try to see who's coming to our workshop, who's seeking to reclaim STEM, and who's trying to find that community at the intersection of science communication and policy while advancing social justice. And so with our workshop, we hope to be a model for inclusive science communication and policy training. Now, these are a few pictures of the last in-person workshop we did. Of course, last year, because of the pandemic, we were virtual. And what makes us unique is that, one, we merge science communication and policy with social justice. Now, the first workshop we did, it was just me and my co-founder, where we vented about not being able to find this space. We pulled the first workshop together within 4 weeks. I don't know how we did it. We thought maybe just 15 people would come. We had 60 people from all over California show up to our workshop. And so it showed that there was this immense need and desire to be able to merge all of these worlds together. Now, the other thing that we did is ensure that we had a diverse planning committee, because when you want to create these inclusive spaces and talk about sensitive topics such as social justice, you can't just make sure that you're inviting a lot of people to the table, but then not change who the leadership is. So we always make sure that we have a very diverse planning committee to be able to address the needs of the marginalized identities that are showing up into our space. We also have an application-based system to ensure brave spaces. Now, this is because in our own trainings and one of my own science communication trainings that I went to, there was a panel where it was supposed to be about diversity in Cycom. And what that panel turned into was people asking, how do I make sure my friend knows I'm not racist? Or how can I be more, whatever it might be. And so that's not what that panel was there for. That's not their expertise. Their expertise was to talk about their science communication and policy. And so that was something that we wanted to make sure we were avoiding when talking about these issues, just making sure that we were creating this brave space, and it wasn't going to be something where there was marginalized identities, once again, providing all this free labor to provide these questions and answers to people. The other thing is that when we are in physical spaces, to ensure accessibility, which tends to be overlooked, and this can look like a lot of things, whether it be virtual or whether it be in person. We also make sure that we have inclusion at every level. This may seem silly, but even down to food restrictions because of people's different dietary habits, having name tags that include that you're encouraging use of pronouns, having different spaces. There are certain spaces that can be more toxic than others. This can include like hosting at a university, for example, where a lot of the scientists may have felt the harassment or something like that at these spaces. And then lastly, making sure that this is a free event. Because we are working with marginalized identities, cost can often be a prohibitive factor as to why some people might attend some of these events. So we make sure that it's free. If they needed assistance with travel, if they needed any kind of funding, and then making sure they're fed, like things like this, to ensure that we're being as inclusive as possible at every single level. Now, I wanted to kind of give a shout out to our current board members. Of course, me and Lana and Kat were the ones who co-founded this workshop. And then Rob and Tamara were actually attended the workshop and then decided to get involved. And so because of them, we've been able to really grow and provide this workshop even more places. Now the impact, so like I mentioned, from our very first workshop in 2018, we were then able to expand and hosted the workshop both on the East and the West Coast in 2019. And then in 2020, we were virtual. So we've had over 50 speakers and 685 total attendees who have attended our workshop. Last year, because we were virtual, we didn't expect to get attendees from outside of the US. So we actually got a lot of international attendees, which was surprising because it shows that this need is obviously not just US based, but it's a worldwide need that people are seeking this space and seeking to merge social justice with science communication and policy, and how do you do this. And this was especially relevant within 2020 with the pandemic going on, and with everything that was happening with Black Lives Matter and a lot of other complicated issues that started arising. And so it was really important, especially to have this virtually last year and to talk about how do we address these issues with science and using our science. So this is a snapshot of our attendees, just so you get an idea of who is actually attending our workshop, who's seeking to reclaim STEM from our 2020 attendees. One of the things we ask on our application is it's an open-ended box. We don't believe in check boxes or categorizing people in that way. And so we ask, what identities do you identify with? And we made a word cloud. This is unedited based on 373 responses from last year. You can see that the biggest identities include LGBTQ, Latinx, women, Black, Asian, and then there are other identities that kind of overlap. So this shows that there's not just also one main identity. We emphasize intersectional identities and why that's important, and why you're not just one identity, but bringing your whole self into STEM includes bringing your intersectional identities and your entire being into these STEM spaces. But also, what does that mean when often these spaces can be unwelcoming? So, like was mentioned before, underrepresented groups' involvement in science communication is narrow, and they experience exclusion due to feelings of cultural imperialism and powerlessness. And of course, this isn't just a science communication or policy problem within itself, but as a STEM issue in itself. And so we wanted to know, with the people who are coming to our workshop, why are they coming to our workshop? Why are they seeking this intersection with social justice? And so when we look at some of the applications, here's a response. Let me just remove the video real quick. Okay. So one says, I'm an incoming PhD student in a cohort of 92 students. I fear my voice will be dimmed, since once again, I'm still an underrepresented minority. There are a handful of Hispanic and Latinx students, and before starting the program, I already feel like less. These feelings subside when I become the nerd node from my family, since I am the scientist. Here I shine with my science communication. And so what's interesting to us is a lot of these applications, the question just says, how does your identity influence your science communication? And what we have found is that a lot of people come into these science communication and policy spaces because of something they have experienced within their own STEM spaces, and they want to increase representation, or they want to change the face of what science looks like by starting a podcast, by creating a blog, or wanting to learn more about science communication. So here's another example where someone said, having an invisible disability has made me feel like I don't belong, like I'm incapable, and like I'm way behind my peers. I don't have any experience in science communication, but if I could get involved in it and impact even a single person's perception about how they view their disability or their ethnicity or their socioeconomic status in relation to STEM and academia, that would be so rewarding. And so it's interesting to us to see what is mobilizing marginalized identities to enter these spaces. And so because we recognize within the application just the different complex ways in which people are entering this space, we want to make sure that we're providing a space that's going to accommodate not just giving skills in science communication and policy, but also how do we talk about social justice issues? How do we talk about being comfortable with these spaces and navigating these spaces when they can be so toxic, when they can be very heavy for folks to be in. And so an example of our virtual 2020 format, this was hosted over 3 hours over the course of 4 Saturdays. And this was basically having a class where we met up every single Saturday and the same group of people came back. And each day of the workshop, we had self-care. So things like, how do I say no? Which can be really hard for someone who wants to do it all, especially in the space of social justice. How do you protect your time? Things such as meditation and breathing and yoga. Also main keynote sessions that cover really important topics, such as what is it like to be disabled in STEM and how can other people help in the movement? Or what is it like to be Indigenous in STEM, etc. And then of course, breakout tracks last year. And this included education, social justice, advocacy, science policy, and of course, science communication. Oh no. Okay, give me 1 second. It's not loading. Okay, so an example of some of the workshops that we have given, this includes decolonial theory. It also includes different identities within science communication or policy spaces, but also topics such as what does it mean if you're a diverse person, or is the second job required? So this means like when you are of a certain identity, do you have to do all this extra work and all this extra labor? Also things like comedy and storytelling and pathways to science policy. How do you even get into these spaces? Writing policy memos, video production, podcasting, advocacy in academia, science writing, making pitch to policymakers, all of these things. And of course, the people that we invite to give these workshops are from marginalized identities themselves, because it's important for the attendees being marginalized themselves that they see themselves in these career paths. But also this provides the opportunity for the speakers to also talk about their journeys, to talk about what it's like within these spaces, how they did it, and that way others can learn how to do it as well. Now, one thing, let me see if it'll show up, hopefully. One of the main things we push is that at the end of every workshop that there be some kind of product. That's still not working. I can link it later, to be like the op-eds or to like a draft of a podcast or have some sort of product walking out of the workshop. And so we've had a list of op-eds that have been released. We've had projects that have been released as well, where people tell their story or they're sharing their science. And this is also helping to build our portfolio, because often science communication and policy fellowships require you to have this extensive experience that often is unattainable because it might be unpaid experience or volunteered experience. And so this helps to build a portfolio so that they can enter through these fellowships if that's what their pathway requires with their career. Now, oh, is it going to show up now? If not, it's fine, I'll give up. Oh, there we go. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. So this is some of the examples of the op-eds that have been published that have come out from our pitch to writing workshop. And so one of the, this is just to highlight some of the important pieces that have come out, especially this one in Sister STEM that talked about their experiences of harassment within science, or for example, the top one that talked about DACA teachers and just the future of teaching. And so it's really cool to see the different topics that people come out of, because not only are they sharing science, but also topics about social justice. And so, of course, because we had a comedy workshop last year, one of the funnest parts that came out of that was actually choosing 6 of our participants to share their comedy pieces that they developed with Kyle and Marion. And so this was really fun to be able to share their story, their science, but in a comedic way, which is often different from the traditional Cycom, I think, trainings where they're just like, oh, let's just do a graphic or do something like this. It's just a different way to share the science and the communication that people are doing. Now, I wanted to share some reflections from the workshop and, of course, some pieces of advice. So at the end, we always ask them, like, what did you think? Because we want to make sure that we're actually being effective in the work that we are doing. So this is what somebody said. The Woke STEM presentation had the greatest impact because I have never seen a Black scientist present their science in a raw manner that didn't censor their identity. And so one of the things we always tell our speakers is, like, when you're coming into these spaces, when you're hosting these workshops, be yourself. We don't want you to code switch. We don't want you to try to be professional. Whatever being yourself might mean, just present in that way. And so this is obviously something that keeps coming up in the reflections. You say, like, well, I've never seen somebody be able to actually be themselves within science, especially when there is so much of putting on a certain persona or trying to assimilate into the STEM culture, or especially having to code switch. Here's another reflection. I learned that the feeling I have always had in my heart that academia is stacked against anyone who is different is actually true. I affirm my own feeling of not belonging, and I think the best advice to tackle this is to make my nonconformity look intentional. So again, even though we're giving science communication and policy skills, people are also learning a lot about just their identities and existing and navigating these spaces. Here's something else. In terms of most memorable pieces of advice, someone said that I am not alone. I found community and that I can succeed by being myself and not muting myself like the majority. And lastly, it's going to take a lot of us to change the oppressive systems in place, but there's a lot of us dedicated to fighting them. And personally, this is also why I love hosting Reclaiming STEM and keep doing it. And as hard as it is, because we're just 4 grad students trying to make this happen, it's because we keep finding community and we keep bringing people into this community. And it just feels like there's more than just one of us trying to push for this change.
We're running short on time. Evelyn, do you mind if we skip ahead to just like a very short discussion since we're running out of time? I know we could spend at least another hour and a half talking about all of these topics, but in the short amount of time we had left, I just really wanted to ask one question for each of you to reflect on. What does success look like if we are really able to advance inclusive science communication where it becomes the norm? That we, like, to the point where we don't have to call it inclusive Cycom because it just becomes science communication. What does that success look like for each of you in your reflections? And in those reflections, if you can include any recommendations that you have for us as philanthropy to think about. Sunshine, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go back through each of you.
Sure. Well, I could say so much about what this looks like. And I do just want to note that, like, getting rid of the inclusive part is definitely the goal. You know, science communication should be inclusive, period. So that power sharing that we talked about before, this authentic, humility-based approach from a variety of people sharing their intersectional identities, I'd love to see all of that. In terms of what funders can do, I think, you know, I really appreciate what Jadida said about intersectional STEM identities. So fund people who have intersectional STEM identities. That's a big one, to do this work. Validate this work by requiring that people pay attention to justice and equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, and perhaps even talking about those key traits specifically in their proposals. Support substantive engagement of junior scholars. And my last one out of many is providing flexible project timelines and budgets allows people to actually build relationships, which are key to inclusive and equitable communication. Thank you.
There's a lot to chew on there. Jadida, your sort of reflections on it.
Yeah, I think this has been awesome. Thank you so much to everybody. I think success looks like deconstructed, like, opportunity, right? It's like a sandbox where there are lots of opportunities and lots of tools, and the ability for folks to pick up the tools and resources they want and build the thing that they want to build. That to me is what success looks like. People having the resource and access to resource and opportunity and power to build what they want in community with others. I think, you know, in terms of, oh, and maybe I would add that not only do we need to remove the name inclusive, but to recognize that most people don't want to be included in the system that exists right now anyway and are opting out. What funders can do, I think the biggest thing funders can do is recognize, understand, and learn and be mindful in the way that they're utilizing power. Often the conversations around power are folks with less power saying, look at what power can do, and folks who hold power being like, I don't have the power to do anything. And that disconnect, I think, can often cause frustration on all fronts. I think understanding and recognizing what power is, and that for folks who have had less power for a long time, that those little things that are throwaway, that sponsorship in a meeting, that saying, you know, they're doing this one thing and they may not know how to do it well, but let me connect them to that person, all of that is power. All that's incredibly game-changing and transformative, and it's part of the generosity of opportunity that like one with power has to do. So there's so much there, but I will stop so that my colleagues can also respond.
Yeah, that is straight up out of like what philanthropy struggles with, that issue of power. It is a ongoing conversation. Ralph, to you with some quick reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's important, in my opinion, is really thinking about the importance of sort of shifting agency to those in the communities who have the ability, who have the knowledge, who have the understanding of their communities, and can be those voices. I think sometimes there is sort of, I think there are sort of these markers, these heuristics that we sort of look to really sort of assess whether or not somebody's capable of being able to do this work. And I think, I think it's incumbent on these organizations that have, again, so much power, so much capital, to really think about, what are the shifts that need to happen, and in order for the communities that have been historically marginalized to have the agency, and for these organizations to trust them with that agency and with that power to do what they see as best and what they view as best for their communities, particularly as it pertains to ensuring that the stories that we're telling are authentic, that they are grounded, that they reflect sort of the experiences of the people who have to contend with these situations in a very, very real way. And I think that's going to be key to us sort of seeing a shift happen in science communication, and that centers sort of marginalized folks and really gives them agency and trusts their agency to do what's right for their communities.
And a last super quick reflection from Evelyn before we hand it over to Vince to close us out.
Yeah, for me in our organization, we're really small. We're just starting out. There's a lot of us that are just starting out. So for us in terms of power, it could also be sharing with us, how do you get your foot in the door? How do you become big like organizations that do have all these funders? Because there's a lot of like secrets in how to do this, and the funding and different connections that a lot of us just don't have, especially marginalized folks that are entering this space, that are changing the face of science communication and policy. And so for us, that looks like, how do we build these connections and these networks to get to where others are today?
Thank you to our panelists, and thank you to the Media Impact Funders for engaging in this conversation, which really is not only the future of science communication, but the future of science itself. And with that, I'll hand it over to Vince.
Yeah, thank you, Kishore. Thanks to all of our speakers, and especially Kishore for moderating this really rich conversation today. I just would reflect on what a number of you had said, that this conversation happens in a moment, in the wake of the verdicts that were handed down yesterday in Minneapolis. And we know that we cleared just the lowest bar toward justice in those verdicts, a necessary step, but does not provide the full justice. I think that what we heard today in this really informative and inspiring discussion was the things we need to do to really achieve a more just and rich society. So thank you all for providing that. And for another piece of context, tomorrow is Earth Day. And so just a little bit of a point outwards to the next session of our Media Impact Forum, which is on May 19th, is going to be focused on environmental journalism, building evidence-based reporting initiatives toward a healthy planet. And so we'll be exploring those topics next month. But for today, thank you all for providing us such a rich understanding of your world. And we will hope to help philanthropy support this work going forward. Thank you all.